Hi guys. Okay, so chapter 7 has 2 pages to it, okay? So the first page is more about vocabulary and talking about context clues. That means when you find a word or you come across a word you don't know, you can read the sentence and try to figure it out with how it's used in a sentence. So the first part of this is telling me the meaning of the word, and then the second part, I want you to put that word, that new word that's underlined, in a sentence of your own. Okay, so that's the first page. There's only like 4 of them, so that's super fast. And then this second page is just asking you questions about things that happen in this chapter. And this chapter is talking about school days. So Lewis and what happens in this chapter with school. So, and these are just, you need to write your answers in complete sentences. Don't make a list, please. Please put those in sentences. Okay, so chapter 7, school days. A few days after the Swans arrived at their winter home on the Red Rock Lakes, Lewis had an idea. He decided that since he was unable to use his voice, he should learn to read and write. If I'm defective in one respect, he said to himself, I should try and develop myself along other lines. I will learn to read and write. Then I will hang a small slate around my neck. A slate is like a little chalkboard. Okay. Then I will hang a small slate around my neck and carry a chalk pencil. In that way, I will be able to communicate with anybody who can read. Lewis liked company, and he'd already made many friends on the lake. The place was a refuge for water birds, swans, geese, ducks, and other waterfowl. They lived there because it was a safe place and because the water stayed warm even in the coldest winter weather. Lewis was greatly admired for his ability as a swimmer. He liked to compete with other cygnets to see who could swim underwater the greatest distance and stay down the longest. When Lewis had fully made up his mind about learning to read and write, he decided to visit Sam Beaver and get help from him. Perhaps, he thought, Sam will let me go to school with him, and the teacher will show me how to write. The idea excited him. He wondered whether a young swan would be accepted in the classroom of children. He wondered whether it was hard to learn to read. Most of all, he wondered whether he could find Sam. Montana's a big state, and he wasn't even sure Sam lived in Montana, but he hoped he did. Next morning, when his parents were not looking, Lewis took off into the air. He flew northeast. When he came to the Yellowstone River, he followed it to sweet-grass country. When he saw a town beneath him, he landed next to the schoolhouse and waited for the boys and girls to be let out. Lewis looked at every boy, hoping to see Sam, but Sam wasn't there. Wrong town, wrong school, thought Lewis. I'll try again. He flew off, found another town, and located the school, but all the boys and girls had already gone home for the day. I'll just have to look around anyway, thought Lewis. He didn't dare walk down the main street for fear somebody would shoot him. Instead, he took to the air and circled around, flying low and looking carefully at every boy in sight. After about 10 minutes, he saw a ranch house where a boy was splitting wood near the kitchen door. The boy had black hair. Lewis glided down. I'm lucky. It's Sam, he thought. When Sam saw the swan, he laid down his axe and stood perfectly still. Lewis walked up timidly and then reached down and untied Sam's shoelace. Hello, said Sam in a friendly voice. Lewis tried to say "Caho," but not a sound came out. I know you, said Sam. You're the one that never said anything and used to pull my shoelaces. Lewis nodded. I'm glad to see you, said Sam. What can I do for you? Lewis just stared straight ahead. Are you hungry? No, Lewis shook his head. Thirsty? Lewis shook his head. Do you want to stay overnight with us here at the ranch? Asked Sam. Lewis nodded his head and jumped up and down. Okay, we have plenty of room. It's just a question of getting my father's permission. Sam picked up his axe, laid a stick of wood on the chopping block, and split the stick neatly down the middle. And he looked at Lewis. There's something wrong with your voice, isn't there? He asked. Lewis nodded, pumping his neck up and down hard. He knew Sam was his friend, although he didn't know that Sam had once saved his mother's life. In a few minutes, Mr. Beaver rode into the yard on a cow pony. He got off and tied his pony to a rail. What have you got there? He asked Sam. It's a young trumpeter swan, said Sam. He's only a few months old. Will you let me keep him for a while? Well, said Mr. Beaver, I think it's against the law to hold one of these wild birds in captivity, but I'll phone in the game warden and see what he says. If he says yes, you can keep him. Tell the warden the swan has something the matter with him, called Sam as his father started toward the house. What's wrong with him? Asked his father. He has a speech problem, replied Sam. Something's wrong with his throat. What are you talking about? Who ever heard of a swan with a speech problem? Well, this is a trumpeter swan that can't trumpet. He's defective. He can't make a sound. Mr. Beaver looked at his son as though he didn't know whether to believe him or not, but he went into the house. In a few minutes he came back. The warden says you can keep the young swan here for a while if you can help him, but sooner or later the bird will have to go back to Red Rock Lakes where he belongs. The warden said he wouldn't let just anybody have a young swan, but he'd let you have one because you understand about birds and he trusts you. That's quite a compliment, son. Mr. Beaver looked pleased and Sam looked happy. Louis was greatly relieved. After a while, everyone went in to supper in the kitchen of the ranch house. Mrs. Beaver allowed Louis to stand beside Sam's chair. They fed him some corn and some oats, which tasted good. When Sam was ready for bed, he wanted Louis to sleep in his room with him, but Mrs. Beaver said no. He'll mess up the room. He's no canary. He's enormous. Put the bird out in the barn. He can sleep in one of the empty stalls. The horses won't mind. Next morning, Sam took Louis to school with him. Sam rode his pony and Louis flew along. At the schoolhouse, the other children were amazed to see this great bird with his long neck, bright eyes, and big feet. Sam introduced him to the teacher of the first grade, Mrs. Hammerbotham, who was short and fat. Sam explained that Louis wanted to read and write because he was unable to make any sound with his throat. Mrs. Hammerbotham stared at Louis, then she shook her head. No birds, she said. I've got enough trouble. Sam looked disappointed. Please, Mrs. Hammerbotham, he said, please let him stand in your class and learn to read and write. Why does a bird need to read and write? Replied the teacher. Only people need to communicate with one another. That's not quite true, Mrs. Hammerbotham, said Sam. If you'll excuse me for saying so. I have watched birds and animals a great deal, and all birds and animals talk to each other. They really have to in order to get along. Mothers have to talk to their young. Males have to talk to females, particularly in the spring of the year when they are in love. In love, said Mrs. Hammerbotham, who seemed to perk up at this suggestion. What do you know about love? Sam blushed. What kind of a bird is he? She asked. He's a young trumpet or swan, said Sam. Right now he's sort of dirty gray color, but in another year he'll be the most beautiful thing you ever saw. Pure white with black bill and black feet. He was hatched last spring in Canada and now lives in the Red Rock Lakes, but he can't say coho the way the other swans do, and this puts him at a terrible disadvantage. Why? Asked the teacher. Because it does, said Sam. If you wanted to say coho and couldn't make a single solitary sound, wouldn't you feel worried? I don't want to say coho, replied the teacher. I don't even know what it means. Anyway, this is all just foolishness, Sam. What makes you think a bird can learn to read and write? It's impossible. Give him a chance, pleaded Sam. He is well behaved and he's bright. He's got his very serious speech defect. What's his name? I don't know, replied Sam. Well, said Mrs. Hammerbotham, if he's coming into my class, he's got to have a name. Maybe we can find out what it is. She looked at the bird. Is your name Joe? Louis shook his head. Jonathan? Donald? Louis shook his head again. Is your name Louis? Asked Mrs. Hammerbotham. Louis nodded his head very hard and jumped up and down and flapped his wings. Great Caesar's ghost, cried the teacher. Look at those wings. Well, his name is Louis, that's for sure. All right, Louis, you may join the class. Stand right here by the chalkboard, and don't mess up the room either. If you need to go outdoors for any reason, raise one wing. Louis nodded. The first graders cheered. They liked the looks of a new pupil and were eager to see what he could do. Quiet, children, Mrs. Hammerbotham sternly said. We'll start with the letter A. She picked up a piece of chalk and made a big A on the board. Now you try it, Louis. Louis grabbed a piece of chalk in his bill and drew the perfect A right under the one the teacher had drawn. See, said Sam, he's an unusual bird. Well, said Mrs. Hammerbotham, A is easy. I'll give him another one harder. She wrote C-A-T on the board. Let's see, you write cat, Louis. Louis wrote cat. Well, cat is easy too, muttered the teacher. Cat is easy because it is short. Can anyone think of a word that is longer? Catastrophe, said Charlie Nelson, who sat in the first row. Good, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. That's a good hard word. But does anyone know what it means? What is a catastrophe? An earthquake, said one of the girls. Correct. What else? War is a catastrophe, said Charlie Nelson. Correct, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. What else is? A very small red-headed girl named Jenny raised her hand. Yes, Jenny, what is a catastrophe? In a very small, high voice, Jenny said, when you get ready to go on a picnic with your father and mother and you make peanut butter sandwiches and jelly rolls and put them in a thermos box with bananas and an apple and some raisin cookies and paper napkins and some bottles of pop and a few hard-boiled eggs, and then you put the thermos box in your car, and just as you are starting out, it starts to rain, and your parents say there is no point in having a picnic in the rain. That is a catastrophe. Very good, Jenny, said Mrs. Hammerbotham. It isn't as bad as an earthquake, and it isn't as bad as a war. But when a picnic gets called on account of rain, it is a catastrophe for a child, I guess. Anyway, catastrophe is a good word. No bird can write that word, I'll bet. If I can teach a bird to write catastrophe, it'll be big news all over the sweet grass country. I'll get my picture in Life magazine. I'll be famous. Thinking of all these things, she stepped to this blackboard and wrote catastrophe. Okay, Louis, let's see you write that. Louis picked up a fresh piece of chalk in his bill. He was scared. He took a good look at the word, a long word, he thought. It's really no harder than a short one. I'll just copy one letter at a time, and pretty soon it'll be finished. Besides, my life is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe to be without a voice. Then he began writing, C-A-T-A-S-T-R-O-P-H-E. He wrote, making each letter very neatly. And I'll show you the picture here of him writing catastrophe on the board. When he got to the last letter, the pupils clapped and stamped their feet and banged on their desks, and one boy quickly made a paper airplane and zoomed it into the air. Mrs. Hammerbotham rapped for order. Very good, Louis, she said. Sam, it's time you went on to your own classroom. You shouldn't be in my room. Go and join the 5th graders. I'll take care of your friend, the Swan. Back in his own room, Sam sat down at his desk, feeling very happy about the way things had turned out. The 5th graders were having a lesson in math, and their teacher, Miss Annie Snug, greeted Sam with a question. Miss Snug was young and pretty. Sam, if a man can walk 3 miles in 1 hour, how many miles can he walk in 4 hours? It would depend on how tired he got after the first hour, replied Sam. The other pupils roared. Miss Snug rapped for order. Sam is quite right, she said. I never looked at the problem that way before. I always supposed the man could walk 12 miles in 4 hours. But Sam may be right. That man may not feel so spunky after the first hour. He may drag his feet. He may slow up. Albert Bigelow raised his hand. My father knew a man who tried to walk 12 miles and he died of heart failure, said Albert. Goodness, said the teacher. I suppose that could happen too. Anything can happen in 4 hours, said Sam. A man might develop a blister on his heel, or he might find some berries growing along the road and stop to pick them. That would slow him up even if he wasn't tired or didn't have a blister. It would indeed, agreed the teacher. Well, children, I think we all have learned a great deal about math this morning, thanks to Sam Beaver. And now, here's a problem for one of the girls in the room. If you are feeding a baby from a bottle and you give the baby 8 ounces of milk in one feeding, how many ounces of milk would the baby drink in 2? Linda Staples raised her hand. About 15 ounces, she said. Why is that? Why wouldn't the baby drink 16 ounces? Because he spills a little each time, said Linda. It runs out of the corners of his mouth and gets on his mom's apron. By this time the class was howling so loudly the math lesson had to be abandoned. But everyone had learned how careful you have to be when dealing with figures. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.